3 seconds. That's all it took for a stranger to decide I didn't belong in front of my own house. 3 seconds for flashing lights to paint my driveway red and blue. 3 seconds for a normal evening to turn into the kind of story people think only happens to somebody else. I remember thinking at first this was just a misunderstanding, you know what I mean? Like maybe the officer had the wrong address or somebody called something in and he just needed to check. Nothing personal, nothing serious, just a quick conversation, and we'd both go on with our nights. That's honestly where my head was at. As I stepped out of my car, loosened my shoulders, and hit the button to open my gate because it had been a long day and all I wanted was quiet dinner, maybe 10 minutes on the balcony watching the sun drop behind the trees. The gate had barely started sliding when I heard a car door slam hard behind me. Not casual, not relaxed, the kind of slam that carries intent. Then boots on pavement moving fast, not cautious footsteps. Either more like somebody already decided the ending of a story before reading the first page. And then a voice cut across the driveway, sharp as glass. "Hey." I turned calm, polite, same way you do when someone calls out, and there he was, halfway up my path already. Patrol lights flashing like a warning signal, hand hovering near his belt. Eyes scanning me top to bottom like he was checking whether I matched something in his head. Not a file, not a report, just something in his head. "What are you doing here?" he asked. No greeting, no introduction, just that. And I said, "Going inside," because that was the truth. Simple, obvious. But he stepped closer and said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "What are you doing on this property?" And right there, I felt that first small shift, like when the air pressure changes before a storm, subtle but real. So I pointed toward the open gate and said, "I live here." And he just stared. Eyes moving from my shoes to my shirt to my face, then past me to the house like he expected it to correct me. Like the building itself might laugh and say, "No, he doesn't." And he repeated it flat. "You live here?" And I said yes again. And that pause after that word stretched long enough to feel deliberate. He finally said they'd had reports of someone checking doors in the neighborhood, and that I matched the description, and I asked what description, and he said male hanging around houses acting like he doesn't belong. And that's when something tightened inside my chest because I hadn't been hanging around. I'd been unlocking my own gate, but I kept my voice steady and told him that, and he said maybe I was testing it. And there it was, the moment it stopped being a question and started being an accusation. And I told him straight, "You walked up assuming I'm a thief." And he said, "I walked up because you look like someone who doesn't belong in a place like this." I remember that sentence clear as day because of how casually he said it, like it wasn't even controversial, like it was weather, like saying it might rain tonight. And I asked him to explain, and he gestured toward the house and said, "Neighborhoods like this don't usually have your kind hanging around." And I said, "Your kind," and he said, "You heard me." And the silence after that felt loud, like even the wind paused to listen. I asked if he was saying I didn't look like I could afford the place, and he shrugged and said he'd seen this before, people casing homes. And I held up my key fob and said, I unlocked my gate, and he said, "Keys don't prove ownership. Thieves get access too." And he stepped closer again, too close, the kind of close that's meant to remind you who he thinks is in charge. And then he said, "You people always get defensive when asked simple questions." And I told him I was being accused in my own driveway. And he said I fit the pattern. And when I asked what pattern, he looked at the house again and said, "Nice neighborhood, expensive property. Someone like you hanging around, acting nervous." And I said, "I'm not nervous, I'm confused." And his tone snapped colder and he said, "Turn around." I asked for what reason, and he said, "Officer safety," and I said I wasn't threatening him, and he said, "Don't tell me what is or isn't a threat." And I raised my hand slowly just to keep things calm, visible, palms, non-threatening posture, the kind of thing you do when you realize logic isn't running the show anymore. And he told me higher, so I lifted them shoulder level, and that's when I saw his hand move to the taser on his belt. Still clipped but ready, and he muttered something about how people like me think dressing nice changes things, and I asked him to repeat it, and he said, "You heard me." And I said, "You're profiling me." And he said, "I'm investigating." And I asked, "Based on what, my skin?" And he said, "Based on behavior." And I asked, "What behavior?" And he said, "Lurking." And I said I was unlocking my door, and he said, "Allegedly." I could feel my pulse in my ears, but I kept my voice steady because I knew the second I showed frustration it would get labeled aggression. So I told him this was my address, and he said, "Prove it." And I said, "I don't carry mortgage papers in my pocket." And he said, "Smart mouth won't help you." And when I told him I was answering his questions, he said I was questioning authority, and I said I was questioning his assumption, and that's when he unclipped the taser and pointed it at my chest. You ever see something happen and your brain takes a second to accept it's real? Like your mind says, "Nah, that can't be happening." Not over this. Yeah, that was me. Standing there staring at that red laser dot on my shirt while he said, "You're escalating this," and I said, "You're the one pointing a weapon at me." And he said, "You're resisting." And I said, "I haven't moved." And he said, "You're refusing commands." And I said, "I'm asking why." And he stepped closer again, voice low, saying, "You think you can walk up to houses like this and not get checked?" And I told him I built this house, and he scoffed, like I'd told a joke, and said, "Sure you did." And the silence after that felt thick enough to touch. He told me I didn't look like someone who built anything there, and I asked what that looked like, and he didn't answer, just ordered me again to turn around, and I said, "Not without cause." And he said, "Last warning," and I asked for what? And he said, "For making this difficult." And I moved one hand maybe an inch toward my pocket to show him my ID, and he lunged forward, shouting, "Don't move, taser," lifting voice sharp like a trigger itself, and I froze with both hands up again, saying, "I'm not reaching for anything," but he said, "You moved," and I said, "I told you I could show you," and he said, "Show me what a stolen key," and I said, "This is mine," and he said, "That's what your type always says." My type. Those words just hung there, and he stepped so close the taser almost touched my shirt and said, "You think I haven't seen this before?" Nice, closed, confident tone, acting like you own something you don't. And I said, "I do own it." And he said, "You don't look like you own it." And I asked what ownership looks like, and he ignored that and ordered me again to turn around. And when I said, "Not without cause," he said, "There is cause, you're refusing commands." And I said, asking why isn't refusal? And he said, "It is, when I say so." And his finger tightened on the trigger, and he said, "Last chance." And I asked for what? And he said, "To stop acting like this is yours." And I looked him right in the eye and said, "It is." The click was small, but the shock was not. My whole body locked like electricity grabbed my bones, knees gave out ground, slammed into me, breath vanished. I heard him yell, "Stop resisting," while I couldn't move a muscle. Cuffs snapped around my wrists while I was still shaking, and he spoke into his radio, calm as anything, saying, "Suspect detained, attempted burglary. Non-compliant taser deployed," like he was reading a grocery list, like reality was whatever he said it was. Then came the twist. He never expected a voice from above, calm and steady, saying, "That is my husband." We both looked up, and there stood my wife on the balcony, phone in hand, watching everything, and he told her I was attempting entry, and she said he used the gate remote. He said I claimed ownership, and she said he is the owner. Not loud, not emotional, just factual. And when he asked if she could verify, she pressed a button and the driveway lights snapped on bright, another button, and the front door unlocked, and she asked if she should bring paperwork down, and right then dispatch crackled, confirming the property was registered to me, and you could feel the whole scene tilt like gravity changed sides. He looked down at me, then at the cuffs, then at the house again, and suddenly it didn't look suspicious to him anymore. It looked real, lived in, undeniable. And I whispered, "I told you," and my wife calmly added that our exterior cameras were recording everything, pointing to the corners where lenses stared down like witnesses that don't forget. And he pulled the taser wires out of my shirt and muttered, "You didn't comply." And I said, "I stood still," and he said, "You argued," and I said, "That's not a crime," and he didn't answer because there wasn't one. He uncuffed me. I stood up, slow, ribs aching, but dignity intact, told him, "You saw what you wanted to see," and he couldn't look at me, and you'd think that'd be the end right there. But that was actually the beginning, because cameras don't blink and footage doesn't lie. And within hours that video was reviewed, statements replayed, timelines checked. And by the next morning, my lawyer had filed notice. By afternoon, reporters were calling. By evening, the clip was everywhere. And months later, the city settled for 7 figures. Medical bills covered, apology, issued policies rewritten, and that officer's career ended. Yeah, that happened. I still live here, still open that same gate every evening, still watch the sunset from that balcony. But now when neighbors slow down driving past, it isn't suspicion on their faces anymore, it's recognition, because they saw what assumption costs. And here's what I want to ask you. Was that officer protecting the neighborhood or protecting a belief he already had? Was it caution or was it prejudice with authority behind it? And how many stories like this never get cameras, never get proof, never get heard? Tell me what you think, drop your take in the comments. And if you've ever seen something like this happen in real life, I want to hear that too, because conversations like this only matter if people are willing to have them.